Pilots are trained to trust their instrument, but what would happen if those instruments would put the aircraft in a position that the pilots didn't expect? What if the reaction would be something completely different than what they have been trained to do? Stay tuned. The accident of CommutAir Flight 4933 took place on the 4th of March 2019, but the lead up to the accident actually started several days earlier. On the 27th of February, 5 days before the accident, the pilot who would become the first officer of the accident flight was flying into a small airport called Presque Isle in northern Maine. He had flown into this destination before and considered himself quite familiar with the airport. During the approach, he noticed that there was a difference between the pink approach instrument needles, who got their information from the GPS-fed flight management computer, and the green needles, who were fed information directly from the ILS approach system. The green needles wanted the aircraft to turn slightly to the right when the pink needles showed that the aircraft was perfectly aligned with the runway. The first officer, who was pilot monitoring of the flight, pointed out this anomaly to the captain, and they both agreed that it looked strange. But the weather was fine and they saw the runway clearly, which meant that they could disregard the indication and just land without problems. Now, Presque Isle was a remote located airport situated close to the Canadian border, and it didn't have a manned air traffic control tower. Because of its northern location at this time of year, the whole area was covered in a thick blanket of snow, at some places as deep as 5 feet. After the flight, the first officer and the captain discussed if they should write a report about the localizer anomaly, but they decided against it, as the captain said that it wasn't necessary. Several other flights who flew into Presque Isle during the subsequent days also experienced a similar anomaly, but only one crew actually reported this to air traffic control. That report was filed on the 2nd of March, 2 days prior to the accident. The air traffic controller who received this report told his supervisor, who then sent on the report to the National Airspace Systems Operations Manager. Now, the FAA rules at the time stipulated that after a report of a navigational system malfunction, a similar report needed to be filed from a second aircraft in order for anyone to take any action on the matter. Now, that might sound a bit strange, but it kind of makes sense, since a single report could potentially be connected to that aircraft's own systems. The problem, though, is that that policy also takes for granted that there is a reasonable amount of aircraft using this navigate, so it can be quickly followed up. That was not the case on Presque Isle, which was a small regional airport. Actually, as it turned out, the next flight scheduled to fly into the airport was going to be the accident flight. Now, if any of the other pilots who had flown into the airport and noticed this anomaly had actually filed a report about it, a notice to air mission, or a NOTAM, would have been issued, and the ILS would have been taken out of service until it could be fixed and checked. But since these reports weren't filed, this didn't happen. But what was actually going on with the instrument landing system? What was causing this anomaly? Well, the ILS system works by the use of 2 sets of antennas who are transmitting 2 lobes of radio signals with different frequencies each. These lobes are then being received by the aircraft's ILS receiver, and depending on how much of each frequency it is sensing, it can interpret it as being high or low on the glide slope, or left or right of the center line on the localizer. The glide slope antenna, which gives information on how the aircraft is doing laterally, is situated next to the touchdown zone, often close to where the poppy lights are situated. And the localizer antenna, which gives horizontal guidance, is located beyond the far side threshold of the landing runway. Whenever radio signals are being used, there is always a risk of interference or blocking of these signals, and therefore the area around the antennas must be kept completely clear. This is actually the reason why aircraft have to hold further away from the runway on the ground when low visibility procedures are in force. Now, experience had shown that especially the glide slope antenna was sensitive to any obstacles around, including snow, so the area around it was kept completely clear, but at the time there was no such guidance for the localizer antenna. So, like I mentioned before, at the time of the accident, the localizer antenna was surrounded by up to 5 feet of snow, and this was shown later to have been enough to disrupt the signals and cause a distortion of the localizer guidance. So this was the situation that the crew of CommutAir Flight 4933 was facing without knowing it in the morning of the 4th of March as they were getting ready for their flight. The captain of the flight was 40 years old and fairly experienced, with a total flying time of 5,655 hours, of which 1,044 was on the Embraer 145. She had started her career with CommutAir as a first officer on the de Havilland Dash 8 back in 2013, after having left her previous airline where she had failed part of her training. In 2016, she had also received a disciplinary letter, after which she agreed to have her performance monitored for the next 9 months, and during that time she couldn't upgrade to a captain. After those 9 months had elapsed, she subsequently failed her initial type rating check on the Embraer 145 in the autumn of 2017. She eventually passed the recheck and was upgraded to captain soon after that. Before the accident, she had slept well and reported that she felt fresh and relaxed prior to the flight. The first officer was 51 years old and was also quite experienced with 4,909 hours of total time and 470 on the type. He had started his career with the airline in July 2018 without any type of training issues, but during the days before the accident flight, he had been home sick with the flu. On the evening before the flight, he felt much better and decided to commute from his home in Palm Beach, Florida, to his base in Newark. Due to some delays on the connecting flights that he was taking, he ended up in bed around 1 in the morning, only 5 hours before he was supposed to wake up for the duty the following day. On top of that, he was still coughing, and he had also been diagnosed with sleep apnea a few years earlier, requiring him to sleep with a continuous airway pressure or CPAP machine in order to control his breathing. He didn't use this machine during the night before the flight because he said he wanted to get into bed early. This meant that even though he reported feeling fine when he woke up, it's highly likely that he was suffering from some fatigue when the duty started. When the pilots met up in the crew room before the flight, it was the first time that they were going to fly together. They went through the pre-flight preparation and saw that the weather in Presque Isle was forecasted to be snowy, with light to gusty winds and moderate visibility. Because of this weather, they decided to take some extra fuel with them, and they then proceeded to check the NOTAMs. Now, except for a braking action report showing medium braking action on the runway and some special instructions to contact the airport prior to arrival to get landing clearance, there was no other warnings in the NOTAMs. The captain asked if the first officer wanted to be pilot flying for the first leg, and that surprised him a little bit because the captains normally wanted to do the first leg, but he was perfectly happy to do it. They then proceeded to brief their one cabin crew, and then they walked together out to the aircraft where they started preparing it for departure. The aircraft that they were going to fly was a 15-year-old Embraer 145XR with no technical defects recorded on it. Once the cabin crew had boarded the 28 passengers who were scheduled for the flight, the door was closed and the pilots requested startup clearance. They received that from air traffic control and started taxiing out for departure. And at time 10:04 Eastern Standard Time, CommutAir flight 4933 took off from Newark and started climbing towards the north towards Presque Isle. On board the flight there were 2 pilots, 1 cabin crew and 28 passengers in total. Now, before I start explaining the accident sequence of this video, here comes a quick message from our sponsor who makes it possible for me and my team to keep making these videos. Before we go any further, I want to cut in here to tell you about Kamikoto's high-quality Japanese steel knives, the sponsor of this video. I love to cook, and I'm very picky when it comes to choosing my kitchen gear because I find that cooking, just like flying, requires precision. And because of that, I am so happy that I found Kamikoto's knives. Kamikoto builds on the legacy of over 800 years of Japanese technology, perfected by generations of knifesmiths. Each knife has been meticulously handcrafted and inspected, and they come with a lifetime guarantee, meaning that Kamikoto really stands behind their products. So it is no coincidence that these knives are used by Michelin-starred chefs all over the world, making them just perfect for all of those delicious meals Sandra, me and hopefully Lucas will be making this December. I also really like that the knives comes in a heavy-duty ash wood box, perfect for storing them or wrapping it into a Christmas gift. So right now, Kamikoto is offering you guys, my viewers, an extra $50 off any purchase that you make if you use the discount code Mentour. So go to kamikoto.com/mentor to get that perfect Christmas gift for yourself or for someone you love who is passionate about cooking. Thank you, Kamikoto. Now back to the video. The climb and cruise part of this flight was completely uneventful. The crew was mostly discussing operational details around the flight, and the first officer mentioned that he'd flown to Presque Isle in the previous week and that he had experienced some issues with the localizer. The captain listened to what he said and responded that they were going to keep their eyes on it during the approach. When they started getting closer to the top of the sands, the captain received the updated weather for the destination, which indicated a wind from 090 degrees at 5 knots, a visibility of half a mile in moderate snow and freezing fog, with broken clouds at 1,100 feet. That meant that the visibility was exactly at the minimum required in order for the pilots to be allowed to start the approach. This was a big difference from the last time the first officer had flown in there, when the weather was nice and clear. After they had finished discussing the weather, the first officer proceeded to brief the ILS approach they were going to fly for runway 01, which included a minima of 678 feet. That's 200 feet over the airport, as well as the missed approach procedure and everything else that's important to talk about. Once the briefing was complete, the captain called and asked air traffic control for descent and was subsequently cleared to descend on their own discretion down to 4,000 feet. The controller also reminded the crew about the runway condition, which was still reported as medium, with about 1/8 of an inch of snow covering it. During the descent, the crew discussed the fact that there was no control tower at the airport and that they would have to get in contact with the runway maintenance crew in order to make sure that the snow clearing equipment had left the runway before they started their approach. Once they were established on the approach, they would also need to transmit their intention and estimated time at the ETA blindly on the common frequency in order to let any other traffic know what was going on. Now, the crew received cabin secure from the cabin and started completing the descent and approach checklist just as the aircraft descended through 10,000 feet. They received a clearance to proceed to a waypoint called Korak and descend to 3,200 feet, after which they were cleared for the ILS approach runway 01. As the aircraft started getting closer to the approach, the first officer activated his approach mode and nav, activating the green ILS needles on his primary flight display. He also made a comment about the needles here, expecting them to screw it up if compared to the pink GPS indicator needles, likely referring to the previous approach he had done into the airport. Now, this remark is interesting because it clearly indicates that he was aware and ready for a potential problem with the localizer, making what's about to happen even more curious. At this point, he also apparently started noticing that he was a bit high on profile, since he made some comments about the use of speed brake and that the thrusts were back at idle. The captain responded by suggesting some flaps to help increase the drag, and the first officer requested flaps 9. So at this point, the cockpit is functioning well, with good crew resource management and normal procedures being applied. At time 11:05, as the aircraft was establishing on the localizer, the Boston Air Traffic Controller notified them that the radar services was now terminated and told them to contact the Common Traffic Advisory Frequency, CTAF, on 122.8. The captain read this back, switched over the radios and called out on the open frequency that they were about 2 nautical miles away from Ferrog and about to start the final approach. A maintenance foreman on the ground answered the call and advised them that the snow-clearing vehicles had left the runway and that the runway was free. The captain responded that they were about 4 minutes out. The snow-clearing team had reduced the amount of snow on the runway as much as was humanly possible, but it was still covered with a thin layer of snow over most of the surface. There were, however, patches of blacktop, around 20% or so, visible on the runway. And that's important because in conditions like this, where everything is very white, a bit of blacktop can be important in order to establish contact with the runway. As the aircraft captured the glide slope, the pilots selected gear down, flap 22, and verified that the correct minima was set, and then they selected 3,000 feet in the mode control panel in preparation for a possible missed approach. The first officer asked for flaps 45 and the landing checklist to be completed, and when the aircraft descended through 1,000 feet above the ground, they were completely stabilized, with all checklists complete and everything looking completely normal. This also included the ILS signal that they were following towards the runway. It was nicely centered. At time 11:08 and 28 seconds, the captain called out that she had ground contact, meaning that she could see the ground below, but not yet the runway. This is a common call often made to relax the pilot flying a bit about the visibility in anticipation of the runway coming into view. The captain now also asked the first officer if he wanted the runway approach lights on. Now, this is a slightly odd question given the marginal weather conditions that they were flying into, but the reason she asked this was because she would have to activate the light remotely because of the lack of an air traffic control tower. A tower would normally do that, but in this case there were none. Instead, the approach lights were activated by the pilots clicking the transmit button of the radio on a separate frequency 5 to 7 times, depending on which intensity of lights they needed. More clicks equated higher intensity. The first officer responded that yeah, he definitely wanted the lights and reminded the captain of the frequency to use, 122.6. The cockpit voice recorder then recorded what sounded like 5 clicks, but it's not clear from the investigation if the captain actually managed to activate the approach lights, because the ground personnel later stated that the lights were off. Between the time 11:09 and 20 seconds, and then the following 13 seconds, the captain called out 500, 400 and 300. This was followed by the first officer disconnecting the autopilot and the ground proximity warning system calling out
approaching minimums.
Now here it is very important to point out a few things. In order to continue an approach below the minimums, both pilots must have enough visual references to safely land the aircraft. This typically means seeing the runway or a large section of the approach lights, basically enough to give visual references for guidance during the landing. In order for this to happen, the pilot monitoring would typically need to call runway in sight before the minimum, so that the pilot flying has time to look out, to make a transfer from instruments to the outside conditions before the minimums are reached. If enough visual references are not obtained by the minimums call, a go-around is mandatory. And after that, any of the pilots can call go-around if they lose contact with the runway. Any go-around call must be immediately complied with. What actually happened in this case was that just after the minimums call was heard, the captain called out, "Runway in sight, see it?" The first officer responded, "Yeah, I got something that looks like a runway up there." Now, that doesn't sound like something a pilot who had a clear view of the runway would say, does it? The actual fact was that the first officer didn't see anything. It was just white on white outside the window with the snow blowing across the windscreen. However, as they were descending further, both pilots now suddenly started to see something. The problem was that what they were seeing was not good. Straight in front of them, a tower of some sort started appearing, and it was alarmingly close to them. The first officer responded by pitching up to avoid hitting whatever that tower was, and by doing so, his speed started dropping. The captain called out, "Watch your speed and go up," just as the stick shaker, the aircraft stall warning system, activated momentarily. The captain now called out, go mist," and the first officer confirmed, "Yeah, going mist, toga, check thrust, flaps 9. The aircraft now started climbing away, but during the initial part of the missed approach, the first officer started apologizing and explaining to the captain what he thought had happened. As he did so, the aircraft stopped climbing momentarily, which triggered a couple of "Don't sink" ground proximity warning systems oral warnings, as well as an associated master caution alert. As this happened, the landing gear had not yet been retracted, and another oral warning went off, highlighting that fact. This go-around was not pretty, and the captain was well aware of that, but to her credit, she kept from discussing it until the aircraft was established at 3,000 feet and the autopilot was properly engaged. Now this serves as a good example of a few things. The first is how important it is to be mentally ready to execute a go-around if you don't have enough visual references when you reach your minima. Every approach should be mentally flown to a go-around, and every landing should be considered a bonus. Trying to establish visual contact below minimums and in poor conditions like that can get you into some real trouble, which is exactly what happened to this crew. The other lesson is how important it is to keep to sterile cockpit, especially during a complex maneuver like a go-around. Follow standard operating procedures, and no matter how silly you might feel about the reason for the go-around, wait with discussing it until the missed approach procedure is completed and the workload has started to reduce. Now, if you want more little tips like that, make sure that you have subscribed to this channel. Once the aircraft was established in the hold as per the published missed approach procedure, the captain now called the airport frequency to tell them about their missed approach, but she didn't get any answer back. She then called the Boston approach controller and reported what had happened, and then requested radar vectors in for another approach. The pilots then started discussing the approach and what could have possibly happened, and the captain asked the first officer if he had lost the localizer, meaning that he had started drifting away from the centerline after disconnecting the autopilot, and he responded that he didn't think so. He said that he likely left the instruments and started looking outside too early, and that he got confused of what he saw. He thought he saw the runway, but then he decided it couldn't be right. He said that it was all white on white out there, and the captain agreed to this. Because the snow on the ground, runway and in the air, combined with the fog and the daylight, made everything extremely white. Interestingly though, it doesn't appear like the pilots drew any parallels to the first officer's previous approach and the problems that he had experienced with the localizer as this was being discussed. In reality, the aircraft had followed the localizer nicely, but like we discussed before, the localizer was leading the aircraft several hundred feet to the right of the runway. It is likely that what the pilots actually saw and interpreted as the runway was the area between the runway and the main taxiway, as it would have a long rectangular shape. The tower that they both saw and avoided was likely a 30 feet high wind sensor pole located to the right of the runway and almost 1,000 feet beyond the runway threshold. The first officer now said that he would stay on the instrument longer on the subsequent approach, and the captain agreed to this. She also asked if he was okay to fly the approach, and he responded that he was. They both agreed that if they didn't see anything on the second approach, they would divert to their alternate, and that they had plenty of fuel to do so that wouldn't be a problem. Now, I just want to re-emphasize here that the solution to not seeing enough at the minimums should not be to stay longer on the instruments. If something is wrong or you don't see enough when you reach the minima, it doesn't really matter what the reason is for that, you just go around. So this discussion that the pilots were having about staying longer on the instruments could indicate a bit of get-theritis. That's when you go out of your way to achieve a goal which might not actually be appropriate to achieve. It is also important here to talk about another psychological phenomenon, and that's something called confirmation bias. We humans have a natural tendency to try and find patterns in things we don't understand, and we often do that in a way that confirms our original mental picture of what's going on. A great example of that is actually what just happened. Confirmation bias has caused several pilots to execute visual approaches into the wrong airport after they convinced themselves of certain landmarks that indicated that it was actually the correct airport they were going to. If you fall victim to confirmation bias, it will take time for the brain to prove itself wrong, and that's time that you don't have when you're at 200 feet above the ground on an approach in poor weather conditions. The captain now made a PA to the passengers and talked to the cabin crew. She informed them that they were going to attempt a second approach, and after this, as the first officer was setting up the aircraft for another approach, she finally got in contact again with the runway maintenance personnel and told them what had happened. She also asked them to confirm that the approach lighting system was on and set to maximum brightness. The maintenance manager responded that the runway was still clear and that he would turn on the lights as requested. The aircraft was now vectored in for another approach, and at time 11:25 they were once again cleared for the ILS approach into runway 01. The crew configured the aircraft as before, and at time 11:26 and 51 seconds they again started descending down the glide slope. The captain now switched back over to the common frequency and announced that they were on a 4 miles final. Again, everything looked completely normal. The aircraft was stabilized at 1,000 feet, and when they passed 500 feet, the captain called it out and the first officer responded, "We're clear to land, I'm inside, you're outside." Again, reinforcing the plan that they had discussed earlier. The captain called out 400 feet and told the first officer to keep the autopilot in until at least 200 feet. The 300 feet call came, and at 11:28 and 27 seconds the captain called, "That's 200, get the autopilot off." The first officer responded, "Off," and disconnected the autopilot. The next thing that could be heard on the cockpit voice recorder was
100
and
Minimums.
from the GPWS system, with the captain calling 100 in between. 2 seconds after the minimums call, the captain called out, "Runway in sight, 12 o'clock. A few seconds later, the first officer responded, "I'm staying on flight directives because I don't see it yet." This in itself was a clear indication that a go-around should have been the only valid option at this point. But the captain responded, "Stay in," several times, meaning that the first officer should keep focusing on his instrument, which, as we know, were giving them the wrong indications. As they were descending these last couple of 100 feet, the pilots again caught a glimpse of that tower that they had seen before, but this time, instead of going around, the first officer just reduced his descent rate slightly to clear the tower. Later examinations of the wind sensor pole showed that the top of it had been damaged, likely from an impact with the aircraft as they were now overflying it. Again, a trained crew should know that an obstacle like that should not appear on a correct approach path into a runway, but this is how strong confirmation bias can be. At time 11:28 and 53 seconds, the captain stated, "What the heck?" and the first officer said, "I don't know what I'm seeing," followed by the aircraft impacting the ground 3 seconds later with a force of 3.35 Gs. Snow was now thrown up over the windshield, reducing the visibility to zero as the nose of the aircraft was compressed inwards. The left main gear was torn off and flung backwards, impacting and damaging the side of the aircraft before it lodged itself between the aircraft and the left engine nacelle. The aircraft finally came to a rest about 230 feet to the right of the runway edge and 3,600 feet from the runway threshold in the snow-filled area between the runway and the main taxiway. After it had come to a stop, the captain noticed that the first officer was bleeding from his head. She asked him if he was okay and then quickly pulled the engine fire switches to shut down the engines. After this, she told the passengers to remain seated and asked if the first officer could help her to run the engine shutdown checklist, which he also did. In the back of the aircraft, the cabin crew initially didn't hear anything from the pilots, but she could hear them talking through the door. She told the passengers to remain seated and then she walked through the cabin to check on their status. Everyone was shook up, but no one was seriously injured. When she came back to the front of the aircraft, the captain opened the cockpit door and told her that they would be evacuating. They opened the front door and were met by firefighters who had come to assist them. The first officer was taken out first and then the passengers were disembarked and walked to the terminal via a path in the snow which had been prepared for them so they wouldn't have to wade through 5 feet of snow. All in all, everyone survived the accident, with only 3 people receiving minor injuries, and that must be seen as an absolutely fantastic outcome. The accident was found to have been caused by the pilots continuing their approach below the stipulated minima without having positively identified the runway. This in turn was caused by confirmation bias when the captain thought she saw the runway, which was actually the rectangular shaped area between the runway and the main taxiway. The captain showed poor judgment by instructing her first officer to stay on the instruments below the minima and not executing a missed approach when both of them couldn't establish visual contact with the runway. The fact that the first officer was likely fatigued also probably impacted his decision making. The report also highlighted that several pilots had previously noticed the localizer anomaly without submitting a formal safety report, which meant that the problem was not highlighted and rectified in time. Several reports were subsequently filed by these same pilots after the accident had happened. A test of the ILS system was performed and the localizer was found to be misaligned more than 200 feet to the right. The area around the localizer antenna was then cleared from snow and the subsequent test showed that the ILS worked perfectly after the snow had been removed. This led to some new snow clearing guidance from the FAA with a new maximum snow depth of 2 feet around any localizer antenna. CommutAir also implemented several changes to their procedures as a result of the accident. Now, this story was interesting for me for a couple of reasons. It really showed how important it is for all of us to speak up if we see something that's wrong or out of place. A report from you, no matter what industry you're in, could be the thing that stops a future accident from happening. It also, again, showed how important proper pilot selection, training and crew resource management really is. Now, check out this video next, which is really interesting, or check out this playlist if you want to binge on more accident and incident videos. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you think that we deserve it. It really helps the channel. Thank you very much and have an absolutely fantastic day. Bye-bye.